Welcome to the Debate at Go8 podcast series. Today we're canvassing a range of issues impacting on the Australian university sector, including cybersecurity, our intake of international students, and our relationship with China. We'll be discussing these topics with James Paterson, the youngest Liberal senator to enter the federal parliament at just 28 years of age. Since making his way to Canberra in 2016, Senator Paterson has had plenty to say about some of the dominant issues of our time: national security, foreign interference, and how we deal with our major trading partner, China. Hello, my name's Ron Candelars. I'm a freelance journalist and producer, and throughout this series, we've been canvassing a range of topics touching upon the work of all the Group of 8 universities. They include the Australian National University, Monash University, UNSW Sydney, the Universities of Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland and Western Australia. In the studio with me today is Vicky Thompson, the CEO of the Group of 8 universities. Well, Senator Paterson, the Director General of ASIO warns us that espionage and foreign interference has supplanted terrorism as Australia's principal security concern. The Australian Signals Directorate has spoken of near-constant cyber attacks on our government networks and critical infrastructure operators. It feels like every day we hear about another cyber incident impacting here in Australia. You've been examining these issues for quite some time. What do we do about it?
Well, they're all right, first of all. It would be nicer to live in more benign times and more calm strategic times, but our reality is that we are living in very uncertain times and very dangerous times, and you have no less an authority on that than Sir Angus Houston, who conducted the Defence Strategic Review for this government and said it was the most dangerous environment in his lifetime. There's a lot of things that we need to continue to do. There's a lot of things that we have already done, and we're on a journey of hardening ourselves and making our society and our economy and our government more resilient to those threats. There are things that we can continue to do, though, to achieve that. The university sector is very important to that, a very important partner for government in achieving that. But ultimately where we have to get to is a situation where no matter the adversary, no matter the environment, that we are strong, that we are socially cohesive, and that we are able to respond and defend our interests and our values in the world.
So physically, what do we need to do though?
Well, government is on a journey itself. It needs to harden its systems, its networks. It needs to make sure that it is not full of technology which is supplied by authoritarian high-risk vendors. It needs to make sure that it invests adequately in its own cyber defences so that it cannot be easily penetrated. And then it needs to share those lessons and expand those lessons to critical infrastructure providers, to defence industry, to universities, to other high-risk sectors which are of interest and are targeted by our potential adversaries. Because if we don't, then we're just leaving the door open for them to come in and take advantage of us. So it's an expensive process, both for government and also for civil society and businesses. It's not free, but the alternative is to leave ourselves vulnerable, which is not an acceptable alternative for the Australian people.
And are you satisfied that we're actually doing that? I mean, it's a long game. It's an expensive game. And you're quite right, we need to bring all the parties together. And of course, I'm representing universities, and we've sat across the table in your former role of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence. Are we in a position where we are all working together to the same aim?
Not yet, in my view. I think we've got a lot more work to do, and I think there is still a lack of appreciation in some parts of society that really we are in a potentially the early stages of an existential threat to our democracy. I think it is no less grave than that, and whether or not we hand a liberal democracy to our children and grandchildren is at stake. And we have certainly elevated awareness of security threats. We have elevated understanding that we need to respond to it. But in my view, we don't have the kind of mentality that we need to make sure we can survive an event like that if it happens, because ultimately these things are mostly out of our control. We can shape our region and the world at the margins in concert with our allies and our like-minded partners, but ultimately the course that our region is on towards conflict or away from it is going to be set in other capitals around the world over which we have limited control.
But how do you bring people with you on that journey? Because it's a fine line, isn't it, between the existential threat that you've talked about often and not having mass panic out in the community.
Agreed.
And then the flip side of that is sometimes like, I just don't believe it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we've seen that as well. So it's a really challenging environment, isn't it?
I think you've captured the dilemma there perfectly, because we don't want people either to believe that it is overhyped and therefore shouldn't be taken seriously, or to have such existential despair that they think there's nothing we can do about it. They have to understand that it is serious, but that it's manageable and that there are achievable steps we can take to address it. And what that requires is calmness, is being measured, is being clear, is being factual, but also bringing the Australian people into our confidence and sharing more with them about what we know about the intentions of major players in our region, China obviously being the most consequential one for Australia, and not to gild the lily or downplay the seriousness of their ambitions, which are extraordinary and even global. And if we downplay the seriousness of that, then we are just putting a false sense of confidence and comfort into the public that I think will be a disservice to them ultimately.
So you mentioned China. What's the motivation behind their state support for cyber attacks? What's the long-term aim here?
The People's Republic of China is fundamentally an insecure regime, and it's an insecure regime because it does not have democratic legitimacy. And the greatest fear which keeps Xi Jinping up at night is that the Chinese Communist Party will follow the path of the Soviet Union and it will ultimately collapse. He's obsessed with the collapse of the Soviet Union and instructs all of his closest confidants to study it obsessively to understand what its failures were to avoid that for China. And his most important objective every day is to maintain the control of the Chinese Communist Party over China. Now, a growing assertive power, which is also insecure, is a very dangerous power because it does things which normal, rational, more secure and confident powers would not do. And so it feels that it must be a dominant power, not just in the region, but globally. It feels it must assert and achieve the aims of its control over Taiwan and other important regional flashpoints. And it can brook no criticism and limits on that internationally because it can tolerate none domestically. That is the heart of the problem. And so why does it engage in cyber attacks on Australia? For two reasons. One is for intelligence gathering purposes. They want to understand our decision making and particularly our insights into the American system as a close American ally. But secondly, they want to pre-position in our networks so that if they ever chose to in a times of crisis, they could activate those to do harm to us. And that was the rationale, the major rationale behind the critical infrastructure reforms that the previous government did, and the investment of red spice of $10 billion in the Australian Signals Directorate, because we know that there are those presences in our systems. We have to get them out of there and we have to make sure that we are resilient to those attacks in the future.
It's not just China though, is it?
No.
I mean, there are many state actors that we need to be wary of.
Correct. China, for Australia, China is the number one threat in terms of state-backed cyber attacks and also espionage and foreign interference. And it is the largest by a long way. But the Russian government is active in this space, the Iranian government, the North Korean government, plus a whole host of completely private actors that are just in it for economic gain. And for the average Australian in their daily lives, they're much more likely to be impacted directly and personally by a criminal ransomware gang that trying to steal their data or extort them or the company who they do business with than a sophisticated state actor. However, the consequences of a sophisticated state actor being successful in a cyber attack are far more serious than even the worst ransomware attack would be.
How did we get to this? I mean, have we been asleep at the wheel over the last decade or so? It seems that it's really heightened at the moment. Now, obviously, there's a lot of geostrategic or geopolitical issues afoot. We know that. But how did we get to this point? And, you know, should we have been looking at critical infrastructure legislation, you know, more than a decade ago? And you're right, it was the former government that introduced that legislation to protect that. We were very closely involved as universities in coming up with a critical technology list so that we don't have another Huawei, that we can protect the assets we've got. But it seems like there was nothing and then there was everything.
Australia is a very attractive cyber target because we are a very digital economy. We're a wealthy country. We engage in very large financial transactions online and we're a very networked country. And like many other countries, we have driven great investment in digitising our lives because that makes our lives easier, but it also makes us vulnerable. The attack surface for a foreign adversary used to be very small and now it's very large, and it includes your refrigerator at home and your television and your security cameras. And so the opportunities for exploitation are great. And I think there has been generally a philosophy of going for the cheapest available equipment and deploying it as fast as possible without sufficient concern for security. And that's a fault on the part of business and civil society and government. It's a collective failure. We're only now waking up to the dangers that pose after having connected all of these things to the network network and open up those opportunities. And to a degree, there's a bit of retrofitting that needs to happen to protect ourselves, but we're not alone in that. The United States and every other developed country in the world is contemplating the same problems.
So you've said previously that we need to look at the way companies engage with the Australian Signals Directorate. You've said that they should feel free to relay any information regarding cyber attacks, etc. And you've talked about where we access our technology from. Can you explain that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, trust between significant operators in our economy, whether they're a telecommunications company, an electricity network, or any other systemically important business, a bank, and our Signals Directorate is critically important because we do want them to be able to seamlessly share threat intelligence that they're seeing on their networks both ways. We want ASD to share that with their partners in industry and want industry to share that. I think we need to take some legislative steps to undergird and support that trusted sharing arrangement. One of the things we don't yet have in this country is a legally protected sharing mechanism between industry and government, so that if I'm an operator of a bank or a electricity network and I'm under attack, I should be able to share with ASD what I know and what I'm seeing about that without the fear that ASD would ever be required in the future to give that to the Privacy Commissioner or another regulator who might investigate me for legal sanction. Now, if I've failed and if I've been incompetent, of course, I should be able to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law and fined for my malpractice. But in the heat of the moment in a crisis, I don't want the lawyers being brought in to mediate the information I share with ASD in fear of what those consequences could be down the road. And in the same way, in a accident investigation in the airline industry, there is that trusted ability to share information with investigators that wouldn't be used otherwise. This has to be available to industry as well.
Yeah. So, Senator Paterson, you entered Parliament in 2016, aged 28, the youngest Liberal senator ever, and you were thrust pretty much into the main game from the outset. We're talking about national security here, cyber security. Very, very important portfolio areas for someone so young. Tell us about your background and how you came to have the experience to provide advice on these things.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily set out to be a national security specialist or for that to be my focus. It was because of the changing strategic environment that I pivoted my focus on that, but also because of an accident of history. My background is predominantly in economics. I worked for a think tank before politics that was domestic policy focused primarily. But in Parliament, I realised the shifting strategic environment and how consequential that would be for future generations. And in 2017, in March, when I was a backbencher, having been in the Parliament for just 1 year, the then Turnbull government and the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, decided that we should ratify a long dormant but never previously negotiated but never ratified extradition treaty between Australia and China. And I was instinctively uncomfortable with this because I knew that China had a 99.9% conviction rate, and I didn't want any Australian citizen or the citizen of another country under our care to be sent to that justice system, and a fundamentally unfree and unfair one. And I also was worried that it would be used as yet another tool of coercion over this Chinese Australian diaspora, that they would be put under even more pressure by Beijing if this tool was available. And so I threatened to cross the floor to vote against the ratification of that agreement, which didn't earn me the praise of the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister, who were disappointed. But fast forward now, it's nearly 7 years on. I think most people would think the idea that we even contemplated an extradition treaty with China is crazy, let alone nearly ratified one. And that's a measure of how much things have changed. But it was from that I fell into national security.
It's interesting you mentioned, when we keep talking about China, and you talked about the need to not frighten the Australian electorate. But in a sense, what you're talking about with these cyber attacks is an unspoken war that's underway now.
That's right. I mean, in many respects, it resembles elements of the Cold War, where ostensibly and on the surface level, there was diplomatic relations, though they were strained, between countries. But beneath the surface, there was hand-to-hand combat through proxy wars or through espionage and foreign interference. And there are elements of that are true today as well. And while we've seen a stabilisation of the bilateral relationship under the new government with China, it hasn't stopped the cyber attacks, it hasn't stopped the espionage, it hasn't stopped the foreign interference. So I think the question we have to ask is how much has really changed, how much has fundamentally changed, and how much is it just that China's government has made a tactical decision to alleviate the public pressure and the public diplomatic disputes by getting rid of the sanctions on our trade and other things, and how much of their objectives remain exactly the same, which is regional and global hegemony.
While in government, you chaired the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and during that period, universities were very much in the spotlight. What was the catalyst for that?
There was a series of reporting about arrangements that universities had entered into in a bilateral sense with China's counterpart universities. Some concern about China's international students studying here in Australia, and some instances of transparent foreign interference on campuses, where either Chinese students who were trying to be outspoken about their concern about the Chinese government or Australian students who shared concerns about that were being intimidated, including some very troubling examples where academics were being bullied and intimidated for things that they said in the classroom, which no Australian government should ever tolerate or permit. We must preserve the academic freedom of both our students and our academics on campus. And that was a heightened concern, and I asked that the government refer an inquiry to the Intelligence Committee to look into this. And what we found was a complicated, nuanced picture. There were some institutions that were well appraised of these issues and were working hard to address it. There were some who were frankly naive about that and didn't appreciate the way in which that really threatened the fundamental values of our universities, that they were being compromised by these relationships. So I think the inquiry was a good process in two respects. One is it brought to public consciousness those issues, and I think it has helped drive some cultural change in some universities. That's certainly what the feedback that I've had. But also it demonstrated what was working and what wasn't working in a policy sense. The University's Foreign Interference Task Force has been refined as a result of the inquiry, and I think while it was off to a good start, is working even more effectively now than it once was. And we do have a better and new appreciation across universities to this problem. I think previously there was an issue where it was being quite siloed in some institutions, and certainly people came forward to me privately and said, I've been banging the drum in my institution for a long time, but I'm struggling to get people to understand how serious this is across the university.
I think that's all true. I mean, at the time, it was awful in that it was, when I say it was awful, it was a really challenging process for universities to go through. And it kind of does go back to that sort of that fine line of, how much, not that we didn't believe, but the thing with dealing with the security agencies is like stuff's going on, but we can't tell you what's going on. And so we really needed, and I've talked about this in multiple podcasts where I likened it to two tribes coming together, one that is just genuinely open, and that's what researchers and academics are, and one that is very closed. So you really had to bring those two cultures together, and I think the process did that and did that really well. And I did sit opposite the table when Senator Paterson was chairing that committee on multiple occasions, but on that major inquiry. And I think that generally, what's come out of it is a much better understanding from both the government and parliamentarians' perspective, but also from the university side, that there is an issue here, and we're actually, we're in the solutions business of having a shared solution here. It's not your problem or my problem. I think where the challenge is for universities more broadly, and I speak as the universities that do 70% of Australia's university research. We've got around 75% of Australia's Chinese students who are studying at our universities, which is not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But I think part of the challenge is understanding from somebody like your perspective and from government more broadly and others, what do you want our relationship to be with China? Because we've had a relationship with China for, the first student came to the University of Sydney 100 years ago. We are increasingly doing a lot more research with China. We are certainly, I would like to think now, certainly informed enough to know where those, tall fences, small paddocks I talk about. But what is the solution from your perspective? Given I'm very aware of your views on China, and we've talked a little bit about this now. Should we just not be doing research with China? I'm not sure that's the answer, but I'm interested in what your views are.
Yeah, that certainly wouldn't be my view that all research cooperation with China should cease, but we do have to be more sophisticated and alert to the risks of it than we certainly were 5, let alone 10 years ago. And there is much more maturity and sophistication in the sector than there was back then, where some arrangements were entered into that I still scratch my head how that possibly got ticked off. One model that I'm interested in that I've observed recently is that in Canada, where they've designated some institutions as institutions with which you cannot do research as a Canadian university and or academic, and also receive taxpayer funding. So if you want to do that research, you can go and do it, but you can't use taxpayer funding to it. And that's about sending a signal to the sector that these are particularly high-risk institutions or high-risk areas of research, and that cooperation shouldn't happen there. And it's not because there's anything wrong with Chinese people or Chinese academics, but it's just a recognition that they operate in a system which is very different to ours, and they have extraordinary pressures brought to bear on them, and ultimately in an authoritarian society have to serve the interests of the party state, the one-party state, or they can't continue to do what they do. And that presents real risk to liberal democracies and open societies that are much more relaxed about our cooperation internationally, and I often feel in quite a good spirit that we're solving humanity's problems, and we should be doing this in an open way, and we should work with anyone who wants to do that, which is a noble sentiment, but one that runs into the reality of a totalitarian state.
In reality, though, shouldn't some of the blame also be put at various governments, Australian governments, given that governments forced universities to seek new funding sources, and that led them to rely on international student revenue to fund research. So that's how we got to this position in more recent years, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm supportive of universities engaging in international education. I think that's a fundamentally healthy thing, and it should just never be the dominant or major source of funding, and we absolutely have a responsibility of governments to provide adequate revenue, so that's not the case. But of course...
But that doesn't seem to have happened, though, over time, does it?
Well, the reality is that universities are competing at the funding table with every other worthy cause in Australia, like primary and secondary education only in the education portfolio, but everything else that government has to do. And in a fiscally constrained environment, there is only so much that governments can ever fund for universities. There are slightly different policy choices that we can make, but there is never going to be a world in which that international student revenue is completely replaced. All I would ask of universities is, as much as is economically achievable, they should seek to diversify that international student income. Now, I recognise that's an easy thing for a politician to say and a harder thing for a university to deliver, because in the case of the Chinese student market, they have a willingness to pay that many other international markets don't have. They are willing to pay top dollar for a high quality education, and diversification to other countries is not that straightforward, but it doesn't mean it's something we shouldn't strive for.
I mean, and I have to say that we are striving for diversification for a whole lot of reasons, not just foreign interference or coercion or security reasons. And I don't think there'd be too many vice chancellors who would disagree. In any business, actually, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. But the reality is, it's really challenging to spin on a dime to an alternative market. If we look at the next biggest obvious market is India, and across the group of 8, I think we've now got around 12,000 students. Indian students studying at a group of 8 university, which is far less than the number of Chinese students. So it's a long game as well. So, there was a time when there was discussions around caps on students or caps from particular countries. It's a very blunt instrument and probably not the right answer to that diversification model. So I think there's not much I disagree with you on in terms.
Can I just on the blunt instrument? In the past, you have said you hoped universities could be spared the blunt instrument of tougher regulations. You also acknowledged that the sector had come a long way from only 5 years ago. Can you expand on those?
Yeah, my starting point is, governments are limited in their knowledge. They don't have perfect knowledge of society or the economy. And the idea you can have a regulator in Canberra who can devise a perfect set of regulations to direct society to a perfect set of ends is, totally incompatible with my philosophy as a liberal. I do want to empower people to make their own best decisions in their own interest rationally, and I think that's the best environment. And there are often unintended consequences from regulation. They impose costs which are really non-productive and take universities away from their core business of educating and researching to, frankly, compliance. So we do have to be very alive to that. Having said that, particularly when it comes to national security, that is one case where governments do have a special set of knowledge which isn't available to the rest of the community because of classified intelligence. And it is up to the government to say what are priority areas and non-priority areas, what are sensitive technologies and what are not. And it is incumbent on government to provide that clarity and that direction for universities. If we do leave it up to universities, then we can't blame them if they sometimes make the wrong decisions there if we haven't provided the clarity that we need to. So that's a burden that can only fall on government.
And there'll always be a grey area, unfortunately, which is around dual-use technology in that particular space. So this is not without its challenges all round. But I think what you do have now is an absolute understanding and willingness from both universities, researchers and governments that this, as I said, is something that we all are very aware of. I don't believe there was ever any sort of belligerent pushback in that sense. Maybe some naivety on both sides. I don't disagree with that. But, we've now got, I think, a fairly good model. The University Foreign Interference Task Force, of which I am a member and a founding member, has certainly evolved over the time that it's been in establishment. Do you think it's doing the job it should be doing?
I think it's good, but it's not sufficient. And the dual use example is a really good one that you highlight, because there are grey areas in dual use, but not so grey as that we couldn't have an open mind about the risks. So to cite two examples without naming the institution, there was one institution who had a PhD student from the People's Liberation Army studying drone swarming, and ostensibly that was for agricultural purposes, but it doesn't require a very creative mind to imagine how else drone swarming could be used. And there was another university that entered into a partnership with a effectively state-owned enterprise in China in the aerospace industry. Again, it's not hard, particularly when Xi Jinping publicly named this company as a champion of his military-civil fusion, to anticipate the potential leakage of that civilian technology to military ends. So I don't want to see too much over-the-top direction from government for universities. I do want to have some empowerment, but I don't want to see learned helplessness either. Like, how could we possibly know that drones could be used in a military sense? How could we know that the PLA might take advantage of this aerospace engineering that we're sharing with them? There's got to be a bit more sophistication. And to be fair, those are historical examples. I don't think any university would enter into an arrangement like that today. I certainly hope they wouldn't.
Just want to shift the focus a little bit, because you talked about the undermining of liberal democracies, more generally, with some of this cyber attacks, etc. But I also want to talk to you chaired an inquiry into extremism in Australia. I read you called out the far right. Is that a serious issue that we're also facing in this country? And we've seen more recently some very obvious demonstrations of extreme right fanaticism on the streets of our cities.
Yeah, it remains a very serious problem, because the radicalisation pathways available to people are so much more seamless than they ever have been before. If you want to access extreme content of any variety, whether it is Islamist terrorist variety or neo-Nazi or white supremacist variety, it's freely available, and it is a very quick process from people first consuming that content to themselves going on a radical pathway and being willing to cross that threshold into contemplating violence in the service of that end. And what's challenging for our security agencies is, in the earlier war on terror era, we were dealing with cells of people who were coordinating with each other and planning attacks that, by their definition, because they involved a group of people who had to communicate with each other, could be identified and could be disrupted. But if you have a lone actor who is consuming extreme content and decides to take a matter into their own hands and do something violent without ever having spoken to anyone else about it, that's much harder to anticipate and to protect against. And that's the concern that I have on both ends of that spectrum. And unfortunately, the events with Israel and Gaza has given a new impetus to extremists of all varieties who seek to have an influence on a conflict a long way away from Australia by taking violent action here in Australia.
You are co-patron of Liberal Friends of Israel. How do you think the Albanese government has managed this conflict, and your thoughts on the pro-Palestinian demonstrations we've seen recently? How difficult is it to find the line between freedom of speech and hate speech?
Well, Australian citizens have an absolute right to freely organise and peacefully organise for whatever political agenda they have. But I have been concerned to see the way in which those lines have been blurred, and we've seen very quickly what is ostensibly a peaceful protest about a foreign conflict morph into harassment of minority communities here in Australia. And the most distressing two recent examples of that was obviously the protests at the Sydney Opera House, and also a protest in Melbourne outside a synagogue on a Friday night during Shabbat prayers, which had to be closed on police orders because they didn't feel that the occupants were safe. If you had have told me even 3 years ago that in Australia we'd be closing synagogues because it was not safe, I couldn't have believed you. And so that is very distressing. In terms of the government's response, I think they started out reasonably well, but have found it increasingly difficult to manage as it has gone on, because they are trying to straddle within their own community and their own supporters people with very strong pro-Palestinian views and very strong pro-Israeli views, and they've been having great difficulty reconciling that and walking that pathway, which I think has led to some funny choices. The failure to send a senior political representative immediately after the crisis was really inexplicable when all of our like-minded partners did so. Canada, the European Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, Germany, France, they all went. We didn't. And I think some false moral equivalences have been drawn, trying to say that settler violence in the West Bank, which is a problem, is equally serious to the 7th of October, which was the worst loss of Jewish life since the end of the Holocaust, I think is a mistake. And that's about signalling to a very divergent community in Australia that has different views. So I think they're finding it very challenging, and I think that has unfortunately led to some perverse outcomes.
We've covered a fair bit of ground, but I just wanted to get a bit of a read on where you go into the future. As I said before, you've been no stranger to controversy. You're quite prepared to sort of speak your views on many, many issues. What's the future hold for James Paterson? You've achieved so much in a relatively short period of time. Any chance we'll see you in the House of Reps in the future?
That's where I was going.
No, absolutely not. I made a very conscious choice to run for the Senate when I did.
Why?
Because senators have a great luxury of being able to totally devote themselves to big policy questions, big values and philosophically led questions. My House of Representatives colleagues who do amazing work have to devote most of their time to servicing their communities and holding their seat, which is obviously a critically important thing in a Westminster democracy. But that just means they have less time to devote themselves to these bigger questions. And there's really only two portfolios that you can't have in the Senate, and that's Prime Minister and Treasurer. I don't suffer the delusion of wanting to have either of those jobs. And so every other job is available to me in the Senate. And really what I want to do is serve in a national security portfolio in a cabinet in the future. And I have one of those portfolios right now, and I'd be very honoured if I had the opportunity to do that.
So the Senate gives you time to have a bigger picture?
Yes, and it's also part of a very explicit deal with my wife, which is Senate only, not House. And the truth about that is that we've got a young family and I'm away a lot with my job, and I have a little bit more control over my time than my House of Reps colleagues do, who particularly their weekends are devoted to going to local football and netball matches and school fetes and other community expectations, and as well as every night of the week. Senators are busy too, and particularly when there's Senate estimates and things like that on, but we don't have that same burden at home. I think it's almost impossible to have a normal family life with that.
Well, Senator James Paterson, it's been great speaking with you today. We've covered a lot of ground, and we'll keep an eye on your progress in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Thanks for your company today. If you'd like more information about the issues raised in this podcast or other related topics, please visit our website at go8.edu.au. And a quick reminder, you can always tune in to Debate at Go8 on Spotify, Google, Apple or YouTube. Bye for now.